But I just want to start off with a personal sort of a story. At the end of the 90s, I was an activist in Delhi, and I was out on the streets protesting all the time. And I got a chance to work with a really old women's group called WILF, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And the job involved going to Geneva for a year and spending time at the UN. So I went from being a really young, angry, hardcore protester on the streets of Delhi to behind a desk in a small office in Geneva. And the first week I was like, this is it. This is, it's about sitting here, walking across to the UN and listening to arguments on, what words are going to go into a document. But over the course of that year, I have to say my youthful arrogance was slowly eroded as I realized that the impact that those words had when they went out, when they went back, were faxed back to their offices, to government offices in their countries, and how they sort of then trickled down. And unlike development, they did often trickle down to mean something in the lives of women. So I think that was an important learning for me, that protest and activism doesn't always mean going out into the streets, but it is also what we now know as advocacy. It's a very sanitized word, far from protest, but advocacy is an important way of channeling protest into change. Yeah. So the case study that I did for the project was on the human rights movement and the women's rights movement, which at many times seemed to flow parallel to one another, but there were times when they converged, intersected. So it was an effort to sort of understand what were those moments of convergence. Okay, so in 1870, Queen Victoria wrote a letter to one of her courtiers. It was a mad, raging letter that asked him, what is this mad, wicked folly called women's rights? Why have we not been able to check this yet? But it wasn't the first time that women's rights was causing a ripple. Mary Wollstonecraft, in her 1792 book, Vindication of the Rights of Women, she questioned the idea of natural rights, which had been proposed by philosophers, which was rights that men should get as God intended. But Wollstonecraft's critique sort of pointed out that women, it didn't take into account the conditions of women who lived according to rules that man had made and not the way God had intended. So those were the sort of first, I would say, the origins of women's rights, really. Natural rights was developed into human rights much later, after the Second World War, which was a very bleak period filled with reflection. It was there was new sort of consideration for human life, for the value of human life, and that concretized into the Declaration of Human Rights in 1940, which was led by Eleanor Roosevelt and did decry discrimination on the basis of sex. But beyond that, didn't really look at, didn't go further with women's rights. Meanwhile, there were feminist movements going on, which, the first and second wave of feminism which began. Human rights also, the period after the World Wars was there were pro-democracy movements, pro-independence movements, anti-apartheid movements. So they all interpreted human rights in their own way. Where did the two converge? The first turning point came actually at the UN Decade on Women, and where there were 3 world conferences. Now it just sounds like 3 world conferences now, but if you speak to the activists who attended those conferences, their face lights up when they speak of what happened at Mexico, Copenhagen, and Nairobi. These were days when there was no email, everything was snail mail. It took a long time to invite someone, to arrange for someone to attend a conference, but each conference had consequently rising numbers of feminist activists who attended. And in Nairobi in particular, there was a huge NGO tent, which was supposedly very vibrant, buzzing, and it was where the seeds of the international feminist movement was sort of sown. And this period has been termed a quiet revolution by scholars. And the important thing was that it sort of created a global sisterhood. And the connections made in Nairobi deepened and became, a rallying sort of a cry for future mobilization. Around the same time, there were radical ideas which began to be inserted by feminists into the discourse of human rights. One of them was, picking up concepts which were very sacred to human rights, like torture and arbitrary detention, and showing them in a new light. So, feminist lawyer Rhonda Copeland's essay, which sort of showed how domestic violence was torture, how women being locked up in their homes was arbitrary detention. So reframing those known terms, but imbuing it with feminist meaning. And the other was, a very radical critique of human rights, demonstrating that it did not accommodate women's, justice for women. So it didn't talk about non-state actors, it didn't talk about the family. So basically showing up human rights as being for the liberal male person, and not, and having an idea of a utopia, which was still a utopian world, which was still patriarchal, which was democratic, which had, which had civil and political rights for a man, but was still patriarchal. It was, the gendered roles remained unquestioned. So these radical ideas actually they gave rise to a new conceptual framework, which was tested in more UN conferences, but this time Vienna was a human rights conference. It wasn't a women's rights conference, which is where there was a women's tribunal on violence against women. Again, a very powerful moment by those who attended. And the conceptual framework was now such that to quote one of the activists, that the conceptual framework was now large enough to allow an incest survivor to a political prisoner to speak on the same platform. And it was this that sort of that legitimized violence, legitimized governments giving space to violence against women in their agendas. So then there was Cairo, where sexuality and reproductive rights entered the discourse, and then finally Beijing, the Beijing Platform for Action. So this sort of brought to the end what was called a golden period of global feminist activism. And the important thing about Beijing was the amazing, the scale of participation was tremendous. Women from rural areas went to Beijing. It was an unprecedented scale. So not only did it lead to the setting of a global mandate for women's rights, but it was also a blueprint for future feminist advocacy. By that I mean that women who went there learned how to negotiate with their governments, with the UN, and learned from each other on how to then go back and really, run